Hi, good evening, everyone. Really warm welcome to this second of our summer term lecture series. So delighted this evening to welcome Jan-Philipp Fuso. Jan came to the drawing school just before the pandemic, and we had a wonderful conversation there, and Jan presented us with a fantastic list of really interesting lectures that he hoped to come and present to us, and it's taken us a pandemic and all this time to finally get him to come and speak, but we're so delighted that he is joining us tonight. So Jan-Philipp has worked in various fields in the arts for the last 30 years and studied art history, film and theatre, as well as English literature and history. He worked as an assistant director in theatre before entering the art world, first as an art critic, then an assistant in a commercial gallery, and since then as a freelance curator and writer. In 2003, he founded the Drawing Hub, the first gallery in Germany exclusively devoted to contemporary drawing, and that later turned into a non-for-profit nomadic platform. He's worked for other international galleries as well, art fairs, among them Koenig Gallery, Borch Editions, and the Drawing Room. He is currently thesis advisor at the Paris College of Art and a guest lecturer at UWE in Bristol and Plymouth College of Art as well. He's personally taken part in exhibitions in Paris, Tokyo, Berlin, Rimini, and Bristol. So Jan's lecture tonight's really exciting. Jan's going to talk about the role of erasing and correction in the creative process, discussing the formal, technical, and aesthetic aspects of erasing as an artistic strategy. And he'll be talking about selected examples from recent drawing history as well. So Jan, thank you very much for joining us this evening. Hopefully you'll magically appear before our eyes now. Hi.
Hi, Fraser.
Welcome. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to talk tonight. I'm very excited about that. And thanks for the warm welcome words. Shall I start sharing my screen? Well,
that's great. Thank you.
Good. So welcome everyone. I'm happy to be here and talk to you about erasure, erasing, and deleting in drawing. Starting with a quote. He drew with vigorous abandon, frequently going through half a dozen of his willow wood charcoal sticks in the shortest of time, and that process of drawing and shading on the thick leathery paper, as well as on the concomitant business of constantly erasing what he had drawn with a woolen rag already heavy with charcoal, really amounted to nothing but a steady production of dust, which never ceased to except at night. Time and time at the end of a working day, I marveled to see that Färber with a few lines and shadows that had escaped annihilation had created a portrait of great vividness. These lines come from W.G. Sebald's book, The Emigrants, from 1991, and describe the drawing process of the fictional artist Max Färber, whom the author modeled on the German-British artist Frank Auerbach. Correcting, erasing, revising as part of the work process is so much an integral part of artistic practice that talking about it seems almost banal and not worth mentioning unless this practice is discussed in a new light of particular formal and aesthetic as well as conceptual questions. I've chosen this subject for today's lecture as I believe erasing and deleting is far more than the simple inverse formula of creative additive drawing. Numerous artists of the 20th and 21st centuries use forms of erasure for their drawings as a device that is able to interact with the drawing support and the drawing tool. This very specific artistic gesture of destruction succeeds in a special way in giving content-related issues a compelling formal expression but also expressing formal qualities in a unique way. The announcement of this lecture on social media was met with a mildly indignant comment regarding the fact that the artist Robert Rauschenberg erased a drawing by his colleague Willem de Kooning. Quote, "Vandalism as conceptual art, hammer blows to Michelangelo," is what it says. This is amusing and interesting indeed, not only because it describes the skepticism towards a gesture that is manifestly understood as an aberration of conceptual art, but also because it refers to the medium of sculpture. For it is traditional sculpture that, in the case of stone and marble, is created by elimination rather than addition. Michelangelo famously spoke of the figure that, enclosed in stone, merely needed to be freed. So here we already have the gesture of erasure as one of the strategies of construction. For drawing, this is certainly a little more complicated than for the classical marble block. So what is being erased may already be there, a blank sheet of paper or surface of another material. But it also can be an already processed structured sheet, a photograph, for example, which is processed, or something is added to the image support, which is then afterwards removed again. In the following, we will look at the most diverse cases of such material manipulation and analyze which forms of creative destruction were used and with what aim and to what effect. We might at times look at work that expands the notion of traditional drawing, but it shall be allowed to circle a little around the media, as drawing has the strength to withstand those deviation lines, as the core qualities seem steady and tight. An exploration of visuality and thoughts by mark-making gestures. And when those fail to be seen clear, we can suggest erasure had been at work. It was the above mentioned American artist Robert Rauschenberg who in 1953 erased a drawing by his fellow artist Willem de Kooning, thus creating a conceptual artwork based on the destruction of another work. How did this come about, and why is this act of erasure, this iconoclastic gesture, not vandalism, as the commentator on Instagram remarked a few days ago? In 1951, the 26-year-old Rauschenberg, who had just studied at the legendary Black Mountain College, created a series of white paintings in the tradition of Kazimir Malevich, whose Black Square of 1915 was the first of a series of paintings that would establish the history of monochrome painting. Rauschenberg's white paintings were unpretentiously painted panels that dispensed with texture and painterly signature. The paintings provoked criticism, and only a few friends, such as the artist John Cage, found positive words about these, which he called airports, where light and dust particles could lend to map the changes in the environment. In his own words, Rauschenberg sought to achieve something similar to drawing and experimented with his own drawings, which he erased. The results did not satisfy him. He was self-critical enough to realize that it was not enough to erase a sketch. What was to be created by the absence of something had to be based on something greater. He came to the conclusion that only the work of a colleague, and an important colleague at that, would create the necessary gravitas. He did not have to think long before he fell for Willem de Kooning, who was considered one of the most important representatives of abstract expressionism at the time. At the end of the 1940s and beginning of 1950s, however, the Dutch-born de Kooning, who lived in New York, had already broken away from an overly orthodox abstract expressionism and taken steps in the direction of figuration. His series of paintings that are called Women, which he created between 1951 and 1953, is famous in this phase. This was the time when the young Rauschenberg knocked on one day on the studio door of his famous colleague, armed with a bottle of whiskey, and secretly hoping that he would not open the door. But de Kooning was at home and listened to the young man's request to give him a drawing to erase. He replied that although he did not like the idea, he absolutely understood it, and here the greatness of the artist is evident, would support it. He chose a work that he said would he would miss, and important detail that would not make it easy for the challenger to erase. The sheet was covered with pastel, charcoal, pencil, oil paint, and it took Rauschenberg several weeks to finally erase it. Afterwards, his friend Jasper Jones helped him find the final form of presentation, the frame and the label with the inscription "Erased the Kooning drawing." So that is what you see here on this image. The frame and the label is an integral part of the entire work. As we could see, de Kooning was chosen because he was a respected older colleague, a kind of father figure of the previous generation. The erasure of the work, a sanctioned form of iconoclasm in this respect, a patricide, but with the father's authorization, a homage and a memento mori. Rauschenberg himself called it a celebration, and he spoke of poetry. We have here the original de Kooning that was at some point kind of brought back to light by X-ray examination. And here we do have the both together. One must not forget that he did not simply destroy de Kooning's drawing, but made it his own piece by piece, spending weeks, if not months, reversing the process of mark making. Traces remain, both of the original composition and of the erasing process. The paper tells the story of this encounter, becomes a palimpsest. We see here in comparison the sheet as it appears today and an X-ray image that suggests the Kooning original composition. Erased de Kooning drawing was first exhibited in 1955 at the Poindexter Gallery in New York, which specialized in abstract and figurative art and represented artists such as Richard Diebenkorn, Franz Klein, and also Willem de Kooning. After several stations in the drawing was present at the groundbreaking exhibition in the Museum of Modern Art's 1978, Drawing Now. And for many years, it helped redefining the notion of drawing as an expanded medium. Discourses about erasure. As Diana Petherbridge writes in her resourceful compendium Primacy of Drawing, are ancient. In fact, the theoretical reflection about the notion of erasure can be associated with the Roman author Marcus Fabius Quintilian and its 1st century AD elaboration of rhetoric. In his book, Institutio Oratoria, which had a strong impact on Alberti's text on painting, De Pictura, published in 1450, he says about language what easily could translate it to the visual arts. Quote, "The next point which we have to consider is the correction of our work, which is by far the most useful portion of our study. For there is good reason for the view that erasure is quite as important a function of the pen as actual writing. Correction takes the form of addition, excision, and alteration. Leonardo da Vinci advised artists that it would be good to make silver point notations in tinted paper sketchbooks for the reason that you cannot make erasures. That is echoed by French painter Jacques-Nicolas Payot de Montalbert, who in the first half of the 19th century wrote that in the past, sanguine, the red chalk, was preferred to the black chalk as it cannot be erased and requires one to draw well at the first attempt. So erasing was over centuries viewed as both useful and at the same time something that needs to be avoided, as it would weaken the artist's ambition to brilliance. The fear of reworking, maybe the death of the first spontaneous sketch, haunted many artists, and it was Eugène Delacroix that formulated that fearful ambivalence. Quote, "Experience ought to teach us two things. First, that we should do a great deal of correction. Secondly, that we must not correct too much." The actual tool, the eraser, made from rubber, was introduced into France in the last quarter of the 18th century as an improvement on a compressed piece of bread or sponge that used to be erased before. Equipped with the appropriate tools, correction was now less of an effort. So one can assume that in the following years, the freedom of artistic experimentation was also supported by the improved possibility of erasing and correcting. Depending on the technique used, this may not have affected some artists, while others may have felt inspired to now give their thoughts even freer rein than they already had. We will now present some forms of erasing, not a final and complete typology, but at least show how diverse the possibilities are to erase productively and creatively. Iterative strategies of obsession are to be found in both the studio practice of contemporary art and in the realm of what is categorized as art brut. The letter to her husband from 1909 by Emma Haug is an early example from the famous Prinzhorn collection in Heidelberg, Germany, founded by psychiatrist Franz Prinzhorn, who in 1923 published his widely influential book, Artistry of the Mentally Ill. Paul Klee and André Breton were among those who studied that book with great admiration. But it was Jean Dubuffet who coined the term art brut in 1948 and who started to collect works from artists that, to his opinion, didn't apply to any accepted artistic category so far. Non-trained artists, marginalized, obsessive, and mentally ill, all of them overlooked in their deep devotion to serious art practice and creative production. As Petherbridge writes in relation to that drawing, meaning has become choked and suppressed in incantatory repetitions of the words in columns of different intensity created by repeated overwriting. Haug presumably produced these rhythmic shafts of obsessive calligraphy during heightened or suppressed states of consciousness. The letters of Harald Stoffers, part writing, part musical score, part pictorial composition, are of a rare intensity, inviting the viewer both to read them and to contemplate them in silent fascination. Stoffers was born in Hamburg in 1961. He joined a workshop for people with disabilities at the age of 22 and began writing single or sometimes several words such as bell or glue gun on small pieces of paper that he handed out to people around him. These brief messages eventually expanded into longer letters addressed to his dear mummy. The words were placed on meticulously drawn lines, reminiscent of musical staves, imbuing them with rhythm and musicality. Sometimes the erasure within the drawing or even of the complete work is the direct expression and visualization of an experience of violence, historically, individually, or collectively. The gesture of erasure carries this aggression, that of annihilation, of killing, of absolute control and authority. It could be depicted literally and embedded into a narrative context of figurative depiction, but also in a more abstract sense, or in a combination of the two, a manifestation of physical destruction as an image or metaphor for violence. In 2002, the Danish artist Jeppe Hein created a work, 360-degree presence, that we see here, which, to call it a drawing, certainly goes far beyond the term, but which is convincing in its conceptual radicalism, in that it takes the process of mark making seriously, which is why it was also exhibited in a much discussed drawing exhibition in the Kunsthalle Baden-Baden in Germany in 2004. Jeppe Hein makes a steel ball react to the visitor's movement and roar through the exhibition space. The heavy ball scrapes along the walls and leaves clear traces. In the long run, it actually destroys the room. The human being is the trigger of this serious process of erasure and can stop only by leaving the room again. In an early work by the American Ed Ruscha from 1960, more collage than drawing, we see a trompe-l'oeil beetle eating its way through the paper. Here, the motive of self-destruction, self-grasping, is transformed into a humorous act of self-reflection. The beetle as motive and occasion of the collage is at the same time its reason for its imagined disappearance. A charming game with illusion and reality, very real threats to the existence of any paper. Here we see a detail. I only have to remind you that not long ago, the alarm sirens could be heard in museums, libraries, and archives because the progressive spread of the paper fish Stenolepisma longicaudata escherichia was a cause for concern. I don't know if it was in the UK the case, but in Germany, it was a serious problem that archives, libraries, and museums had really to take serious measures to prevent those little bugs from eating their holdings. Self-erasure is the subject of a work by Mona Hatt, more a kinetic installation than a traditional drawing. Mona Hatt made self-erasing drawing in 1979. Another version of it exists under the title Plus Minus from 1994, replacing conventional drawing tools, pencil and paper, with a motorized toothed metal arm and a circular bed of sand. Hatt mechanizes the practice of mark making and erasure. At a rate of 5 rotations per minute, the sculpture's hypnotic and continual grooving and smoothing of sand evokes polarities of building and destroying, existence and disappearance, a simple but striking image of processes of our life. Barbara Walker is a British artist based in Birmingham. Her work is informed by the social, political, and cultural realities that affect her life and the lives of those around her. Growing up in Birmingham, her experiences have directly shaped a practice concerned with issues of class and power, gender, race, representation, and belonging. Show and Tell was a 3-month residency at the New Art Gallery Walsall, which culminated in the production of a series of large-scale charcoal portraits that depicted members of the public who visited the gallery. One of the main distinguishing features of this approach was the use of the gallery walls as a canvas for the works. In this light, the execution of the drawings directly onto the walls of the gallery and their subsequent erasure was used as a device to make reference to and further explore the impermanence and shifting nature of identity. Walker, quote, "It does take a lot of strength. From the first mark on the wall, I know the drawing is not permanent. I have already let go. But still in creating it, I won't cut corners, and the detail is very important. I also leave it for the audience to interpret it. I'm interested in people looking at my work and bringing different perspectives to it. The works are meant to be monumental. They are meant to stir and to have an impact." William Cantridge is a master of erasure. In the drawings and animated films of the South African artist, the process of transformation is always transparent and present. Quote, "Time is charged with material in yet another way. Charcoal and paper are not ideal substances. You can erase charcoal, but never completely. The paper is strong. You can draw, erase, redraw, erase again, without wearing it out completely. But the repeated processing leaves traces. The erasure is never complete. The carbon dust settles as a gray haze in the paper fibers, a ghost of the old image before its correction. The film in the camera records the change as well as the spirit of all previous changes. All are stored in the camera. Time is transformed into coal dust, into worn cellulose fibers, into the abrasion of the eraser on the surface of the paper." Ja Madawi is a Tunisian-born artist, but living in the UK. We see crumpled sheets of paper in jars with characters that look like Arabic script, but are in fact completely abstract, only imitating script. They seem to be a memory of text whose meaning remains hidden. The act of erasure is shown here in the partial burning of the papers, which have thus shrunk into a sculptural form. Adel Daoud's early work was inspired by his upbringing at the Turkish border and by Kurdish stories and legends. This drawing from 2014 shows the horrors of the Syrian conflict. The artist depicts gruesome scenes in charcoal and then scratches them out using an eraser to show literally how time erases collective memory. The title Charbon de chair refers to both the drawing material charcoal and the subject matter, burnt flesh, human charcoal. Erasure of memory here works, as we can see, only partially. Traces are still left, but they remain blurred and sink slowly into forgetfulness. Machines, we tend to think, redeem us from this dilemma of forgetting. They store what we are unable to keep forever, and still we know that the perfect memory, the storage of everything, the cloud of eternal knowledge, must also be a delusional attempt. In 2014, the two Berlin-based artists Axel Anklam and Thomas Henninger won an art and architecture competition for the Federal Ministry of Education and Research in Berlin. Their design for a drawing machine, which has now been realized, bears the title Die fröhliche Wissenschaft, the joyful science, which refers to Nietzsche's text. On a large blackboard, a highly complex computer-controlled drawing apparatus creates and erases images over and over again. A sponge erases the drawings and the machine starts again. From a large pool of stored data sets, the machine retrieves them based on an aleatory principle. A Dürer drawing, the floor plan of the Chartres Cathedral, a DNA strand, a score by Johann Sebastian Bach. The knowledge of the world, fragmentary and for a brief moment in the dialectic of creation, erasure, assertion, and revision. The random generator determines the sequence. The execution of the drawing in white chalk is highly precise. One could have imagined this idea on a computer screen, but it is precisely the blackboard that possesses the special haptic quality and a great frame of reference to the history of knowledge, to education, and to storage of information. In an essay entitled A Note Upon the Mystic Writing Pad from 1925, Sigmund Freud proposed a deceptively simple image of the relation of the conscious and the unconscious mind. The object in question is a child's toy, a resin or wax tablet over which is laid a thin, transparent sheet. One writes upon the celluloid portion of the covering sheet, which rests upon the wax slab. For this purpose, no pencil or chalk is necessary, since the writing does not depend on material being deposited upon the receptive surface. If one wishes to erase what has been written, all that is necessary is to raise the double covering sheet from the wax slab by a slight pull, and the sheet is an empty surface again. Wunderblock or palimpsest. This is what Freud describes. And artists like Tacita Dean, Cy Twombly, and Joseph Beuys have all been fascinated by the blackboard as a kind of palimpsest or wunderblock. Tacita Dean, apart from her film work, Tacita Dean has built an oeuvre of blackboard and chalk drawing over the last couple of years, decades. The Roaring Forties, 7 boards and 7 days, is one now in the collection of the Tate Gallery. Dean's work is full of complex historical and cultural references. The Roaring Forties is the name given to a zone in the southern Atlantic. Dean creates an epic scene narrative that is at the same time dramatic and fragile in its appearance. The chalk drawing, threatened with erasure by a single gesture, narrates the passage in the perspective of a film narrative with details of individual camera shots, as if to assert the fiction of a documentary narrator. Idris Khan. If time were to shrink into a single moment, the world might look like a work by Idris Khan. The artist, who was born in Birmingham in 1978 and works photographically, sculpturally, or installatively, he paints and films, but always he layers different media. For example, every page of the Quran, the notes of every Beethoven sonata, or every postcard Turner has produced, or the Tate Britain has produced of Turner images, in such a way that a condensation of colors and forms up to the abstraction is created. His work has been described as experiments in condensed memories. While photographic in nature, the resulting images possess characteristics more akin to drawing or painting. Here we see actually him working on not a photographic work, but on a layering of gestures. That's a detail from a show at Victoria MIRO Gallery. Cyprian Muresan, All Images from Elaine Sturtevant, book 2014, is a large pencil drawing on paper. The Romanian artist Cyprian Muresan copied all of the reproductions from a monograph on the American conceptual artist Elaine Sturtevant onto a single sheet of paper. And the result is a montage of overlapping images which create apparently contradictory perspectives and depth. Muresan's drawings add repetitions, as she referred to them, of iconic works by mostly male 20th century artists. All Images from Elaine Sturtevant book is one of an ongoing series of drawings by Muresan based on artists' monographs. In earlier drawings, he appropriated illustrations from those on artists such as Agnes Martin, Malevich, Giotto, and Antonio della Messina. The series was prompted by a book in his possession on the Dutch conceptual and performance artist Bas-Jan Ader, and the myth that Bas-Jan Ader had drawn on the same piece of paper consistently for 4 years, each time erasing the previous drawing before beginning a new one. In his drawings, Muresan does the opposite. Rather than erasing, he accumulates all his images on a single page. The next piece is a video. By the artist Erasure. Well, physical labor creates the world around us, constructing buildings, manufacturing goods, cooking, cleaning. Yet all too often this work remains unrecognized and invisible. We see the end product, the finished building, meal, clean house, but not the process, not the labor of the workers that created it. Based on the filmmaker's own early experiences of working as a cleaner, the short film Erasure uses repetitive actions and the textures of ink, bleach, and other cleaning products to reanimate the labor of domestic work, performed over and over by many generations of women, but then forgotten and taken for granted. Next work is by Debbie Hein. In 2004, the American-Korean artist Debbie Hein created her first drawings of Greco-Roman heads entirely and solely out of eraser rubbings. Her first shock in Korea had been the amount of effort by young art students in repetitively or sometimes mechanically copying models of classical sculptures like Venus de Milo, also at the Louvre, or Giuliano de' Medici by Michelangelo at San Lorenzo, Florence, like the typical sculptures you would copy as a student. Hein's drawings of a monochrome palette is deceptive. It is not made by pencil or charcoal, but by collecting all her eraser rubbings and painstakingly gluing them on paper. Hein reconstructed the time and effort of an art student, laboriously sketching and erasing over several hours to capture the ideal beauty and proportion of a Roman bust. At the same time, she seems to question that practice of copying in the classical academic manner as meaningful to a student nowadays. Marcel Botas, La Pluie, Projet pour un texte, 1969. A man, we see here two stills from the film, Botas himself writes a text sitting in front of a wall under the open sky. While he's doing this, rain starts to fall, which is so heavy that writing becomes impossible. But the protagonist does not stop. Botas denies to be a filmmaker, and one will have to agree with him. The 2-minute film is closer to poetry than to cinema. The writing, thwarted by the rain, becomes a miniature poem, and as in a haiku turned absurd, which normally speaks of a moment of observation of nature, the scene tells of an artist defiantly writing against the elements, who persistently tries to ignore the erasure of his writing. Christian Halstead. In his ongoing series of Eraserhead drawings, the artist selectively erases sections of images cut from newspapers and magazines, transforming their meanings in ways that hint at hidden or subtextual layers beneath the surface of received media-sanctioned culture. Oscar Munoz. Colombian artist Oscar Munoz draws on the hot pavement in Cali, the city of his childhood, by copying pictures from obituaries in daily newspapers. He draws the portraits with water, and when he's almost finished with one, the first lines already start to evaporate again. So he has to start all over. Here, erasure is inherent in the drawing material of water. Its ephemeral nature makes the drawing seem like a memento mori, an echo that briefly brings the deceased back to life. Beyond this very specific reference to the memory of the dead by Munoz, it is very basic considerations that the Chinese artist Song Dong makes about his works, which use the same technique. He draws Chinese landscapes, people's profiles, daily utensils, and barcodes. Because the stone he uses is hot, it is impossible for us to get a complete scene because the whole picture is constantly in the process of disappearing as it is drawn. Song Dong's works addresses the elemental quality of water as an indispensable element of life, from which we come. He says, water, calm water is like a mirror. So I always thought that a mirror is a mimic of calm water and that calm water is the original mirror. Mirrors are not a physical material, so to speak. They are spiritual material. philosophical material. We come to know ourselves through the mirror. However, we cannot fully understand ourselves, we know ourselves, so I've said before that everything is a mirror. In fact, whether it is water or any other material, they all have their allure, and the allure of water is its formlessness. It lies in the coming together of being and nothingness. Speaking of mirrors and the gesture of Erasure, pop cultural mythologies have taught us that vampires are the only ones not visible in mirrors. Everyone human and life appears in them. You cannot take a picture of a mirror that does not show your own image. The mirrors are prisons of our own image, and they have always played an important role in the history of art in general, and in the history of painting in particular. We think of famous images of Holbein, Caravaggio, Velázquez, Manet, but also of Goya and Matisse, just to name a few. French artist Bertrand Lavier questions visual habits by extracting carefully selected elements of our banal everyday life, pop culture, or art history, covered in paint, put on a pedestal or combined one with the other. Traffic signs, refrigerators, pianos, cars, or other objects familiar to us are isolated from their usual context, deprived of their function, and converted into an artwork. This mirror we see is covered with a thin layer of acrylic, becomes blurred. It only partially erases the reflected image. It leaves behind a shadow, a diffuse corporeality without a face. In a history of blur, one can discover the most diverse attitudes as to why artists wanted to counter the conventions of perception of their time. Turner declared that he wanted to paint what he saw, not what he knew. Seurat, it seems, goes even further in his drawings than in painting in terms of forms of blurring. Here it is the reaction of the conti shark, which the coarse-grained Michelin paper that leads to extreme blurring effects. Think of Antonioni's film Blow Up, in which the enlargement of a subject is pushed so far that only the coarse grain of the chemicals is visible on the paper. A contemporary heir is the German artist Slawomir Elstner, whose blurred crayon drawings can be understood as an homage to old masters from the collective memory. Another Seurat and Slawomir Elstner. Here we see his homage to Vermeer's Girl with a Pearl Earring from 1665, a painting that belongs to the most famous images in art history. To see the original masterpiece transformed into a colored pencil drawing and into an image completely out of focus raises the question of how perception works. How far could you push the original work into a blurred abstraction that all of a sudden develops its own quality? It is particularly texture, in its particular texture, where painterly brilliance has evaporated. Especially those works of art that became uber famous, the celebrities of the art world, the Mona Lisas and Marilyns, the Munch Cry and the Blue Boy. Those are the works that in their mediated presence have already been erased and became an image on a shampoo bottle or a t-shirt. Jonathan Owen, British artist born in 1973, his work focuses on transformation, and his drawings use this tool to carve ink away from the paper rather than add it to the surface. This work is one of a series in which the artist has altered the pages of a book on public sculpture, from which each image, from each image, a public statue has been rubbed out to form an inanimate background, and the details of the scene it inhabited have been removed, despite knowing that the task could easily be accomplished with computer programs like Photoshop. Owen values the inevitable imperfections that arise when the process is done with an ordinary eraser. In these drawings, Owen performs a subtle form of vandalism, transforming the simple and everyday info, the ghostly and enigmatic. The residual traces left behind leave clues as to what was once there. Non-erasure, pentimenti, repentir. out them spots, as Lady Macbeth famously said, describes the failed attempts to erase the guilty evidence that, even though it is not visible to others, stays in her mind and is a marker of the atrocious crime. There is no erasure where it should have been. Things remain existence that should not be. A stain, a line, a face, a leg, an entire body. There are various words for this reminder that the creative mind doesn't always wander in straight lines, that the multitude of creative possibilities always requires decisions. Repentir in French, or pentimenti in Italian, Reuestriche in German. The presence of these lines is also always an indication of authenticity. If there are pentimenti hidden under the painting, one can assume that it was the artist's original design and not that of a forger. The question arises whether leaving these mistakes visible does not create some form of aesthetic quality. We observe ghost lines, a bizarre anatomy of doubled hands and multiple legs, 3 heads where there should be only one. Roger Despires, the French artist and art critic, said that elegance is not a question of correctness. It creates movement and dynamism, and this in turn may inspire the work process. An option may be the next drawing. Erasure needs to be final. Erasure needs not be final, as we have seen. The traces of erasure are the indications of the thought process, which is more evident in no other medium than in drawing. This quality is celebrated when we look at erasure, because the dialectic named in the title always refers to the positive added value that arises when the polarity of absence and presence, of negative space and form, are visible. In this sense, creative erasure in the creative process is always a gain. Thank you very much for your attention and patience. And now I guess we are open to questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jan. That was truly fascinating, and it touched upon so many of the things that we all deal with through drawing every day in terms of material and rehearsal and time and imperfection. It's a fascinating subject, and it's really interesting to see it presented in such a way. We do have a bit of time for questions. If anyone would like to ask a question, you can do so by writing in the Q&A box or the chat box, and we'll pass those on to you. I was just interested to potentially hear your thoughts on what you think about the aesthetic appeal of seeing erasure in a drawing. You think we're sort of naturally inclined to like an image that somehow shows the working out? Do you think we're inclined to like an image that sort of shows the workings and therefore has this kind of perceived gravity of being hard won or sort of painterly or more artistic somehow? Certainly thinking about those sort of Frank Albach drawings and the kind of appeal that they have to art students because of that kind of perceived notion of the artist kind of frantically rubbing out and the kind of romance that goes with that. Do you think we are sort of naturally inclined to gravitate towards works like that?
Well, it's difficult to say, like in general, because the processes are really individual, and for one artist it might totally make sense to work like that, and it leaves really a visual trace of the process, and the process sometimes needs to be visible, where in some works you really don't want to kind of destroy the perfection of an image with any traces that are left. So it I think really depends if you want the audience, the viewer, to see how you achieve the result, or if you want to hide it in a way. I think both can be charming and important for the individual process. So I think there's not a clear answer to that, because processes are different. I find it's very often very intriguing to see how someone was struggling, or someone was like developing a process. And I mean, speaking in general about the medium of drawing, that is something that we very often can see, the process, that traces are left, because if we work on paper, and I don't talk about now the expanded notion of drawing that I have a little bit presented, like film and even sculptural works. But if we speak about paper or similar supports, even with canvas, that there is always more or less the traces of the process left, and either you erase it or not. But even, I mean, I brought a lot of examples depending on the material. With charcoal, it's way more difficult to completely erase. So that apparently can be very important to understand a piece of work.
Yes, I guess there's something reassuring almost about seeing the kind of human hand behind a work, and that it hasn't materialized out of thin air onto the page, and the struggle that's taken place.
Exactly. Yeah.
We do have some questions in the Q&A box. So Tom asks, would you be able to speak a little bit about the relationship between erasure and the process of forgetting?
Well, that's interesting, because we had a couple of examples of like memory based artwork. Like we talk about Cantridge, for instance, work that is highly political because of the notion of memory that is also transferred in his drawings. And I think sometimes it might be a little bit difficult to project those content-related questions into some formal aspect. But I think in his case, you can clearly say that all his work is about memory, for instance, and that the idea to completely erase something seems problematic, because as we have learned from psychology and Freud, the things that we try to bury in our memories, they will come back. I mean, to erase something without a trace is difficult, and the memory functions like that. At some point, there are little leftovers that come back like a boomerang, and maybe even more problematic. But well, some artists really play with that notion.
Thank you. And a question from Ord. Hi, Ord. Can you give examples of any artworks where the process of erasing has gone so far that it actually causes damage to the support surface, sort of holes in the paper, etc.?
Yeah, that's actually, I think with Auerbach, you might have sometimes examples where the paper already got highly worked on, that the surface is being damaged. I mean, some artists, I could have brought way more examples and talk maybe 2 hours. Some use sanding paper or burn the surface to burn compositions into the surface. And if it's paper, that is of course super delicate and sometimes destroys or almost destroys the surface. The balance is complicated to find, but it requires a very good paper to work that kind of forcefully on the surface, like Auerbach did. I mean, with Site sometimes you might have works that also through a lot of reworking of the same identical gesture might have rubbed off a little bit of the paper. But I guess in more contemporary works, yeah, but I don't have a specific name.
And a question from Mary Edwards. Do you perceive a difference between erasure and omission with reference to Seurat's choice of paper and the effect of paper spaces in the finished drawing?
Yeah, that's interesting. It's more like a linguistic problem, or like a problem of vocabulary too. I was thinking of like the artist Louis Hopkins, for instance, who very often works with omissions, not like actively erasing, but leaving space open. I think that's just a different process where you, in the beginning, maybe have a different idea of what areas of the paper you leave open, whereas the erasing comes afterwards as a decision that is meant maybe to correct. I would suppose that is a little bit a different mindset in planning to organize the surface.
Question from Germana Fiscale. What was the reaction of the art world at the time to Rauschenberg's erasing?
It took some time, I think, until it really became famous. It was, as I said, it was exhibited then, but not as a scandalon, so to speak. I think maybe also because de Kooning agreed to that, it was not that much seen as really someone destroying the work of another as a kind of hostile gesture. Well, now it's kind of an icon of modernism. But at that time, I don't have evidence that it was like very criticized. De Kooning himself was a little bit annoyed that it became so famous. He said, "Oh, I would have preferred that it would have stayed among us," but then it became, well, what it became. And he was fine with it in the end. But I think he was thinking, oh, maybe I shouldn't have done that.
And a question that follows on quite nicely from that, from Sally Reckert, is the support surface with the ghost of the drawing more important than the drawing itself?
Difficult to answer.
Yeah.
I guess it's a play between the two levels. The ghost, of course, it's like an echo, a visual echo that is there, but it depends how strong it is. I mean, it can be intentionally used as something that really draws attention, and sometimes it might go a little bit back in the background of the visibility.
Yeah, no, I guess that kind of links as well back to my question at the start, which was, was perhaps maybe a tipping point where the actual sort of rehearsal and the evidence of an image coming to be is more interesting than the sort of final image itself. And yeah. I think how often I look at the Matisse drawings where you can see that kind of process in them versus a drawing as brilliant as it is, where he's definitely made a single line, which is beautiful as well. But there's something about seeing that process that just has a sort of visual appeal and adds an extra layer to the thing somehow. Yeah.
I just had a look at the Picasso sketchbooks also, and I mean there are so many examples of that too. They are beautiful in that way. Well, there's definitely a subject to elaborate more on that.
Sure. Well, the next time. Thank you. I think that brings us just about to time. But thank you again so much for sharing with us. It's really, really fantastic, and a joy to have you with us at long last.
Well,
thank you so much.
Enjoyed, and maybe there will be another time too.
Great. Thank you, and thanks everyone for tuning in. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Fraser, and well.